All right. For those of you, thank you for joining us this morning. As a reminder, this is our DEQ volunteer monitoring template. We're going to be reviewing our new template that we will be debuting this season. And Nick Paxton Evans and myself, Kat Maloney, will be hosting this webinar. We have a few items to go over, and then we can get started and start diving into the template. So again, reminder that this webinar will be recorded. Keep yourself muted and save all questions for the end if you can. We will have a Q&A at the end. We're going to be reviewing two very similar templates. One is our GRAB template we're going to be focusing on, as well as for a template for continuous data, which is very similar. We will review the differences. Both of these are living documents, so if you notice anything that's causing you issues, please let us know. We do want your feedback. I think we're set to go. Again, save your questions, stay muted until the end, and then we will answer all your questions at the end.
So with that, I think we're going to start with the GRAB template. So as most of you are familiar, or many of you, you're probably familiar with our old templates, and you're going to, I think most of you, or I should say, we asked that most of you in the emails, go ahead and take a look at those two tutorial videos that were provided on the DEQ website. And in my emails, I described that these are kind of uniform templates that we're switching to across, or at least for a couple programs within the DEQ laboratory for data management. And so we modeled, or basically adjusted or adapted, the volunteer monitoring program templates from the DEQ's call for data templates, which is why I asked you to take a quick look at those tutorials, because these templates are almost identical in format and styling. And so if you had gotten familiar with the call for data templates, then you'll already be introduced to kind of what these new volunteer monitoring templates will look like and how they function. For those of you that didn't get a chance to look through those tutorials, it's not the end of the world, but we would ask that at some point after this webinar, you kind of go back and take some time to look through those tutorials, because we are not going to go through all the specifics of these templates that those tutorials will help you with. We're kind of look at these templates today and kind of show how the volunteer monitoring templates are unique, and kind of point out some of the things that will help you go through it. So we will have a brief overview of these templates and how they function, but those tutorials will help you a lot more before you get started in filling out. Okay, so again, for those of you that were able to look at the other call for data templates over the past couple of weeks, or maybe just got into, looked at the emails or these templates when we sent them out earlier, this could be familiar. But this is the GRAB submission template. You'll notice that if you look across the bottom of the field of the template, most of you are familiar with Excel. We have several tabs at the bottom, and all of these are color-coded in order to kind of guide you through the process of filling this out. I first want to emphasize that all of these the white, the kind of salmon orange colored, and the green tabs, the green colors, are all informational guides for basically filling out the blue tabs. The blue tabs are going to be where you actually enter your information. Everything else is just guidance and valid values that we ask you to use. So as we go through, if you look to the top of these columns, the white tabs are all general information about the template. The orange or salmon colored tabs, they are specifically linked to one of the blue tabs. So they will go through the column headers describing everything, what should be in each column for those blue tabs. And again, the blue tabs are going to be your data entry form, where you're going to be actually entering information. And then those lime green tabs at the far right, or at the bottom of this list here, those are the valid values. And as probably you can imagine, as DEQ gets more and more information in from third parties, and we collect data from the call for data and collect data from volunteer groups, it becomes more and more difficult to kind of get that data in and assimilate it into the proper formatting that we need to be able to put it into OCWMs and equally share that with the water quality exchange. So all of those standardized values, we kind of were incorporated into these templates. And so that's why we're asking that we have a much more strict adherence to using those valid values. And that's one of the main functions of these new templates, is to kind of get everybody's information in a standardized format. For those of you that were familiar with the older templates, they didn't have that much control over or how data was entered, and it was a little more confusing or less clear exactly what units and the characteristics that we needed. So this template, it really helps guide and kind of narrow down what's acceptable, and so it'll help us get the data out publicly more efficiently. If you scroll to the right a little bit, you'll see that there are some color codes for the columns as well. Columns with a green fill colored are required for that we would ask you to fill out. The orange there is going to be conditional. So depending on some of the answers you put into a required column, a conditional column might light up in that kind of hashed red coloring. That means that you've answered a question in a required column that requires more information from us. So that conditional column will become highlighted in that hash color. And then the white, anything with a white column header, that is optional. We ask that you provide as much information as you can, but these are columns that would be beneficial for us to have more information, but they're not required for us to properly process and share the data that you're providing to Aquams and up into the water quality portal. And then below that section there, we do ask that you adopt a standardized file naming convention. I'll just point out now that some of this information will, if you're first time submitting to the DEQ or you don't know any of this information, we'll be providing an organization ID for you and your organization, and that'll kind of match what your organization ID will be moving forward as your data goes into Aquams or it goes into water quality portal. Your project ID is just a standardized unique identifier that you've put into your project, and we'll talk a little bit about project IDs as we get to those tabs. But for volunteer monitoring program partners, just if you can imagine, some of you have multiple projects going on at once. Maybe you have an OWEB grant for some monitoring on one part of your watershed, and then you have another project going on that's associated with an SIA or something like that. We ask that you create a unique identifier for that project and only submit data one project at a time, and not kind of combine projects into one template. And of course, the year of the data should be in a 4-digit format. Whether it be just a single year, you can just put the 4 digits, or if it's spanning several years, just enter in the kind of names there, and then maintain the existing rest of that file name. Okay. So the other white tab that you'll see here is a neat little function that has been developed, and these are just kind of lookup fields. So if you have a question about, say, what a HUC 8 code is, or a unit of measure that's standardized, what units we're looking for, these tabs can be, or these little lookup tables can be used to search that out. So what this will do is that you'll enter in a field, and then it'll look to those valid values tabs at the end and kind of find one. And so Kat's typing in here temperature. Well, what's the characteristic name if I'm measuring temperature? Well, you can see that there's a number of temperature characteristic names that are suitable for Aquams and for the water quality portal. For majority of you that are just taking temperature, water temperature, that's what we'll want to see, is temperature and water. Similarly, if you're wanting to say, I want to look up what are milligrams per liter, obviously there's a lot of ways. There's the mg capital L, mg lowercase l. What do we want here? So if you look for milligrams, well, I guess per liter there, it'll mg/lowercase l, and that's the standardized unit that we'll want all of that information. If you're submitting dissolved oxygen, and you want to know what milligrams per liter is. I should note, or here we go, yeah, and Kat's typing in degrees. Well, how do we want to see degrees Celsius put in? And so you can type in degrees or Celsius, and it'll come up with the standardized unit that we need to see in these formats. And so it'll be degrees, DEG space capital C. I should also point out that these lookup tables are linked to the tabs and your lookups throughout these other tabs. So once you've done looking one of these up, it would be important to clear all the screens or clear all the fields so that it doesn't affect your lookup at other tabs in the worksheet. We have populated, for those of you that have a contract lab for your sampling, we have a list of NELAC accredited laboratories in Oregon, and you can find the name and the city that they're in, or vice versa, look by a city and look up a lab name. This is obviously not a complete list of all the laboratories that are acceptable to be contracted with in Oregon. This is just kind of what we have for our NELAC list. If you find that the laboratory that you're working with and has appropriate QC and QA, they're just not NELAC accredited, you can go ahead and put those new laboratories in the fill out in the sheets, and we'll continue to add appropriate labs to this list for future iterations of the template. Okay, I think that's everything else for that tab. So again, we do encourage you to look through or listen through Dan Brown's tutorials about these templates. But we want to kind of go through some of the major differences that the vol and material monitoring templates are going to have versus the templates that were explained in those tutorials. And again, we see these color codings. I want to point those out again. And there should be this color code guide on each page. But essentially this tab, the salmon colored tabs, again, this project info tab is linked to the project's blue tab that you'll actually be filling out. And the purpose of these tabs is to kind of give you information of what's expected, give you an element description for each of those columns that you're going to be filling out. I want to point out that for those of you that did notice in the other tutorials that there's a project ID code. For all data that comes into the DEQ, we have a project ID, but it was determined a while back that all data that comes into the DEQ through the volunteer monitoring program is going to get lumped under one project ID, and it's the volunteer monitoring program ID. Now, that's not to say that your data isn't still associated with your group. Your organization is still linked to that data, but because of the way that it comes into the DEQ and because of the data evaluation that we conduct on the volunteer monitoring program data, we put that all under one project. But because we think it's important that we understand which unique project you're working on when you submit data, we still have the information here, or the opportunity here, to enter in a project name and project description each time you submit data. What we do require when you submit data is to indicate whether yes or no you have a QAP or SAP associated with this data, and that it's whether or not it's been approved. If it has been approved, kind of indicating what agency approved that QAP or SAP. And then if it's not one that's DEQ approved and we don't have one on file for that project, we would ask that you submit that data or submit that quality assurance plan or sampling analysis plan, and just kind of give us the name of that file and what type of attachment it's going to be. And Kat, if you could just click on that project attachment type link, this will kind of show you how these function. Anytime you see kind of an underlined and link format in these fields, you can click on that and it will jump to the valid values for that field. So project attachment type, we want you to send in your QAP or SAP. It's going to be acceptable formats are a PDF, a zip file, or a doc file. Okay. So moving on to monitoring location info. It's really important, and we need to emphasize this again. For most of you, you really understand this over the years if you've been working with monitoring data and things like that. getting accurate monitoring information or monitoring location information is essential. When we get data from groups, we understand how things happen in the field, and sometimes, you'll sample in one place for 1 year, but then the next year, maybe a landowner changed their mind about whether or not they would give access, or maybe there was a major shift in the stream and you no longer can access the point that you were sampling at. But from year to year, or every time we get data in, it is very important that we have very accurate location information, lat longs and descriptions and things like that, so that we can properly assign the data that you're submitting to the actual water body that you're monitoring. For those of you unfamiliar with the past, over the years, DEQ has used several different kind of names for these kind of monitoring locations. In the past, that we had a data management system that was called LASAR. So you might see in some of the old forms the LASAR ID, which is again a monitoring location, a DEQ assigned identifier. We've kind of moved away from LASAR. You'll still see that in some conversations and some data sheets and things like that, but we're kind of moving on to DEQ station ID is kind of the more thing, because we no longer use LASAR as our data management system. All of those things are to say that when data comes in through the volunteering monitoring program, we will assign a new data DEQ station ID to your monitoring stations. And that is to emphasize that this data is not just from, through a call for data where we're just asking for data. This is data that, as a partnership with the DEQ volunteering monitoring program, you have a set approved quality assurance plan, and the data is being evaluated by DEQ staff with a little bit more rigor. And so because we accept this data and we strongly support the volunteer monitoring citizen science data that comes in, we give it a DEQ station ID. For those of you that have never submitted before, or maybe you've submitted but we haven't communicated well enough with you, every bit of data that comes in will be assigned a DEQ station ID, or it will be assigned to an existing station that we already have on record. So this is to say that when you're going to the tab for monitoring locations and you're getting ready to fill out the information for your monitoring, if you don't have the information of our current DEQ station ID for that monitoring location, we just ask that you put in a unique identifier for that monitoring ID, and then we will assign station IDs to that. Otherwise, if you know your DEQ station ID, please put that in the format that you see there. Kat, if you could just highlight that or kind of point it out with the mouse. Up in the element description, there's a 5-digit number -ORDEQ, and that's kind of how we have the set format for DEQ stations. Again, to reiterate, if you don't know the station ID for your first submissions, we will accept whatever unique identifier you have for that, and then we'll inform you of what the DEQ station ID is to that moving forward for future submissions. Okay, so the monitoring location info. Okay, so I guess we want to briefly look over our valid values tabs before we jump to the blue tabs. Again, this information is kind of there for you to know what standard values we want. And I don't want anybody to be overly intimidated by this. This looks very immense and a lot of information. And some of it's not how we would normally talk about our different activities and our different QA that we talk about in our SAPs and QAPs. Activity type is important because when you're filling out information, as you can imagine, there's a lot of different lab analysis, a lot of quality controls, a lot of descriptors of what kind of different activities that go along with water quality monitoring. For the bulk of the volunteer monitoring program, we really don't ask for really specific laboratory QC results. Most of you don't even, or some of you don't even have a contract laboratory, so you don't need to know all of these laboratory information and quality control values. But we did highlight specifically for the volunteer monitoring program templates some of the more common quality or ID or activity type codes that you will need to recognize. And if you could scroll to the right just a little bit, Kat, so we could see that last code. So these codes are the codes you'll be entering into your data sheets for your information. But so FM, it doesn't sound familiar, but those are field measurements. So that would be something that you're using, saying you're taking an in situ measurement with a meter in the field, or if it's a physical monitoring observation or something like that, those would be field measurements, maybe a Secchi disc or something like that in a lake. And that's different from our previous templates in that we'd kind of just put samples and field measurements under the same kind of category. But actually, we're splitting those out, and we have a field measurement code for an activity, and then we have a, if you could scroll down a little bit, we actually have a SR is a sample. So if you're taking an actual sample and removing it from the matrix and taking it for a laboratory analysis, that would be an activity type of a sample, or a routine sample, or SR. And if you just go back up a little bit, so, and then the associated quality controls for those types, you could see the QRM is the replicate, and in our conversations, usually with quality control, we call these a field duplicate, taking a measurement twice in the same location to kind of establish a precision. But all this is to say that there's a lot of activity types in this field, and you'll see that throughout a lot of these lime green tabs where there's a lot of information. Just be comfortable to know that A, if you get confused about anything, Kat and I are around to help everybody through this transition to these new templates. But B, the majority of the information you see here is not going to be applicable to your project or your monitoring, but it is there. We want to keep it there at the risk of being somewhat confusing, just because some projects get more complex and involve a lot more laboratory analysis, and so we want to keep all this information in there, as if people need to use that potentially when they're submitting data through the volunteer monitoring program. Okay, so we're jumping to our first blue tab. Again, I keep referring to the tutorials that Dan Brown had put together for the call for data. This would look familiar for those of you that have listened to those tutorials. In Dan's presentations and for the call for data, they request that this organization tab only be filled out once and submitted to the DEQ the first time you submit data. I want to distinguish that the volunteer monitoring program is requesting that you fill out this tab for every data submission. And for the most part, you can take the template and fill out all of the information that's going to be repeated from time to time and save that information so that you're not having to refill this tab out every time you submit. But we do ask that you provide this information with every submission. So that's one distinguishing feature between this and the call for data templates. All of this is pretty straightforward, and we hope that the examples completed on the right help you out as you're filling out the information on the left. Again, color-coded tabs so that you know what we're kind of requiring versus what is optional, or what is conditional, and then what is optional. You'll notice that this is a little different also from the call for data, in the sense that because we work so much with OWEB or DEQ 319 grantees, and a lot of the kind of turnaround times and reporting deadlines for those grants are associated with how quickly we can get data reviewed, and you can get your submission confirmations to meet your grant reporting deadlines. We ask that you enter that information here for the data that you're submitting, so that we know what grant idea might be under and in what years the funding is, and so that we can kind of get a turnaround time or potentially get an idea about prioritizing some data review so that we can get those turnaround times for you and meet your grant deadlines. So again, this is the blue tab for projects. We talked about this in that salmon project info. This is the actual where you're filling this out. There are several lines here, but again, to start off with, we ask that you only submit one project at a time per submission template. So you would enter in a project name and a project description if you feel like it. If you have an approved QAP, you would click yes. And here's an example of what happens when you enter in a certain answer to a green required field. You'll see that kind of red hash mark come up saying, hey, if you said yes to this, then we want some more information in this next column. And then, of course, you have the opportunity to tell us if we don't have your SAP or QAP on file, if it's not a DEQ approved QAP or SAP, then we would ask you to just submit that information with your submission, and we need the attachment name of the file and then the type for that. Monitoring locations. This is, again, very important. So as I mentioned before, we would ask that you enter in the DEQ station ID for your monitoring locations if you know it. If you don't, please create a unique identifier for that station. You can see Kat is filling this out. There's a lot of drop-down options, or if you wanted to, like she just did, you can click on the link to kind of look at what the possible valid values are for that. For the majority of our volunteer monitoring partners, estuary or river or stream are the valid location types. Lat longs, we ask if you could hover over that, Kat, for the lat long. So a lot of these will have information or pop-up windows to guide you as to what format we would like the information in. Again, that's also available in those salmon info tabs, but we also have that kind of pop-up guidance here. We would like lat and long in decimal degrees, and so these little hints or tips will help you put it in the correct format. And we don't need to go through every single column here. There should be some explanations of what each column is, and some of them are pretty explanatory, self-explanatory. Other ones, if you have more questions, you can jump to the salmon info tab to kind of get a better description of what's required and what these columns are for. But yeah, overall, I mean, the template's designed to kind of help guide you through and what we're expecting for each bit of information. And so this is where I feel like, from my own personal experience working with all of you, where we might have a little bit of intrepidation when switching to this new template. I think the major thing to talk about here is that this is the results tab. And for most of you that have been submitting to the DEQ through volunteer monitoring program over the years, you're used to a kind of a wide format for data submission. And this is going to be a major change because we are now switching to a long format of data submission. So each line itself represents one data point, as opposed to in the wide formats before. You're going to have one monitoring location, and maybe you collected 5 parameters at that, and you would have all of those parameters across that line. We are asking now to move to a long format where like I mentioned, each data point represents one line. Now we're hoping that over time you'll become familiar with this results tab. You'll kind of become familiar with what's appropriate and what's associated with your monitoring and what's not, so that you can kind of move through and seamlessly and learn for those of you that may be really good with Excel, some of the shortcuts and tips about how to downfill and fill in all of the information that you need, and have some other shortcuts. Or maybe you'll need to contact me or Kat, and we'll help you through some of the questions that you have about this. But I don't want anybody to feel intimidated, even though there are many, many fields on this tab. Like I mentioned, the majority of this is not going to be necessarily associated with your monitoring, but we wanted to have all of the options available for all the different types of monitoring that our partner groups are initiating. So as Kat just pointed out, when you're filling out a monitoring location, these drop-down lists are linked to that previous blue tab of your monitoring locations that you've entered. So because she put in that one point, you can now drop down and enter those there. And we ask that for consistency and standardization, obviously, we would like you to use those drop-down menus so that there's no cross transcription errors when you're going from one tab to the other. So grab discrete sample data. This is something that might be confusing. Most of you look at grab data and say, well, I just, I took it at a certain start time. I took the grab sample. Well, how could there be an end time? And that's really only focused on if anybody's doing a composite sample. And that would be like an activity type. But again, if you just put in a date and a time into this, it's going to default. Your end time is the same as your start time, or a 1 minute later. So it basically took you a minute to grab a sample or something like that. But if you do need to change that end date and end time, whether you're taking composite sample, feel free to make those adjustments. And again, if you have questions about your particular monitoring, we can answer specific questions for each group as we go through the process of this transition. If you could just kind of scroll over, yeah, you'll see a lot of things here. Sample tissue anatomy, biological intent, subject taxonomic name. A lot of this is really not it's not important to much of your monitoring out there. Some of you will be doing macroinvertebrate sampling. Maybe a few of you do fish samples or tissue samples, but a lot of this can be ignored. So again, don't be intimidated by the number of columns. So activity type, again, you can do a drop-down look, or you can click on the link at the top to kind of see what we're looking for. And this lookup menu, again, we've highlighted the most common ones for volunteer monitoring groups. And you would just probably say field measurement. Yeah, so again, you'll see that error. If you put in something that doesn't match that field, then it will, obviously it'll give you an error like you saw before. This activity ID column we wanted to point out because it kind of stands out as weird. That's a locked column. So based on the other information that you've entered about that activity, we assign a very specific distinct activity ID to that result. And that's basically just to identify it, and that result has that unique identifier going through into aquams and things like that. Sample collection method, pretty straightforward. Depths and heights, that's for if you are maybe collecting a profile in a lake or are taking multiple samples at the same location. This is where you would use these this information. And we can just kind of, hopefully go through as you get more familiar with your with the template and how it matches up with your monitoring. It hopefully will become a little bit more familiar to you, and you can understand what you'll need to enter and what you won't. I did want to point out that there are some fields here that are very specific to laboratory analysis, or if there's very basic measurements or sampling. All of that information, if it's intimidating now, I just wanted to point out that we are here to help you. And if there's questions about what is appropriate for your monitoring, if it's not readily discernible from your quality assurance plan or your SAP, we're here to help, and we can walk you through these processes and get the right information in for your submissions. I did want to point out before you move on, this last column, it is a results. It's kind of the only place that we have, unfortunately, for each result that has a comment place, or where you can add a comment. And that's important for us, especially for you being the groups out there doing the monitoring and collecting the information. Any information from maybe your crew's field notes or anything like that that might put question to, or can indicate that we should downgrade data. To add any information that you can add that would maybe inform any data quality information in that result comment field for each result. And again, if it's for an entire sampling event and you need to you know, kind of copy that down to multiple results, that's appropriate too. So that's kind of all we had for the grab data. So now we just wanted to jump over the continuous. You'll notice that it's almost, as far as formatting and style, it is exactly the same, and that's intentional to kind of make sure that everything's consistent. So we won't go over how everything is similar with the grab data, but we will talk about a little bit about how they're different. You'll notice that for continuous monitoring, we have some additional tabs here, a deployment tab, a pre and post tab, and an audit data tab. And those of you familiar with the continuous monitoring with your quality assurance, we have slightly different quality assurance than for grab data, which is mostly precision or duplicate data. So for deployment, you'll notice that, well, let me back up. So how we take in continuous data at the DEQ, especially through the volunteer mining program, is we kind of assign information and we accept it in kind of packets called deployments. And so that deployment is based, what we define a deployment is based on a monitoring location, a piece of equipment, and then the start and end date and time for that deployment, quote unquote. So some of you might be expanding your monitoring and you're looking into year-round monitoring. Some of you just do seasonal monitoring for the summer months for temperature or DO or things like that. But for all intents and purposes, we need to have kind of a set packet, a starting point and an end point to accept data, and then we assign a deployment to that information or that data. So it's important that we have all that information. When you're looking at monitoring or continuous monitoring deployments, some of you are familiar that we expect for quality assurance that a field audit is conducted at the beginning of a deployment, and then a field audit is conducted at the end of a deployment. All that information would go into your audit data tab. But here in the deployment tab, there are some instances where groups have put data in, or have put a logger into the water, but didn't get a field data or field audit at the same time, or maybe they waited a day or something like that. So for us to identify on the actual data flow that when you submit your continuous data, the raw data, we would like you to put the deployment start date and time, and that would identify when the actual when the logging device went into the water. And then a deployment end date or end time would be either when the logger comes out of the water, or when you're cutting for continuous or year-round deployments, when you're saying, you know, that's the end of this deployment. So we can identify the endpoint in the raw data. Again, we have the formatting there that we'd like to ask you to use, year, month, date, and then 24-hour timing format as well. Let's see here. Okay, so let's move on. So if you click on the results info, please, Kat, you'll notice that this is much smaller than the results info for grab, which is, you know, great to hear for those of you, but that's kind of made up for the fact that there's usually a lot more data in continuous monitoring submissions. So there's very few information here, but yeah, for each data point, we have all this information. And again, this is kind of a long format where each line in this tab will be associated with a data point in your continuous monitoring. So next we'll go to the pre-post. So again, those of you familiar with the QA for monitoring, continuous monitoring, we have usually require a pre-deployment accuracy check, usually done in a controlled environment like a laboratory or an office or something like that. And this is the opportunity for you to put that information and submit that with your continuous raw data. And we also, for those that are doing seasonal or, you know, seasonal deployments or one-time deployments, we would also ask that you put the post data in this as well. And for those of you familiar with the old templates, this is pretty similar to what the old templates were, so not much of a change here. And for the audit data info, these are the tabs required for that. Again, those of you familiar with the QA for this type of monitoring, a lot of this is similar to what you would see in the old template, just a slightly different format. But again, I think it's important to point out for our QC purposes that not only the accuracy checks for the pre-posts, but it's important to have those field audits in there. And it really is important for us. And we'll talk about QC a little bit at the end of the presentation, but we do ask that you emphasize accuracy and filling these out with all the information that you can. And QC is, of course, important for all of us. And if we just kind of jump through the deployment tabs, again, the info tabs kind of describe what each of these columns is for. The start and end times, again, formatting is important. If you click on a field, it should give you an indication of what we're looking for. And we understand that similarly to the old templates, there's a lot of cutting and pasting when you're doing continuous monitoring submission. And we hope that you can work with, over time, kind of come up with a good system for getting data either from your download software or your manufacturer software that's associated with your logging equipment, and quickly get it switched over to a template or the style and format of the template here, so that we can make this efficient for everybody. Similarly, like I said, much smaller results column, but again, those of you familiar with the old templates, there's just a couple extra IDs or a couple of extra pieces of information here. Your equipment ID can be anything. We usually ask you to use a serial number, but any unique identifier for a piece of equipment, as long as you keep that identifier consistent for your organization for the life of that piece of equipment with you over submission time after time. And then similarly, like we pointed out, the pre-posts and the audit tabs are all pretty similar to the old templates for those. So you should, if you submitted continuous data before, you should be familiar with that process.
We're going to now go over what we do for submitting to DEQ and what we do with the data afterwards. I want to say thank you to Nick for presenting and helping go through that template. And we'll have, again, just a reminder, we'll have the QA session at the end. So please save your questions. So the next part, once you have completed the data and you're ready to submit it and get your authorization for OWEB or just be ready to go on to the next set of data, we would like you to submit the completed forms as soon as possible. It is a lot easier for us to reach out to you if we have any questions, if you submit it shortly after completing the data set, as opposed to waiting a year or two before submitting it, which I know we all do occasionally because we are so busy. But if you can send those forms as soon as possible, we can review them and get you your confirmation email. And we are working on 2 new ways to submit the data. You can submit it via an online submission form that will be up and running by the time we have these new templates up, or you can send us an email at wqbalmon@deq.oregon.gov. We will have the shared email so Nick and I can both check that and respond and get you that confirmation after we have that initial review. All right, so I'm sure a lot of you may be wondering what's next. What do we do with that data once it's been submitted? So as you'd imagine, with those large spreadsheets full of data, we have a lot of processing that we do. We do quality control checks. We do assign a data quality level depending on various factors, whether there's appropriate quality control and field checks, duplicates, lots of various factors go into that. And again, we can accept and reject the data based on that QC and the DQL that we do assign. As far as what we're looking for grab data, we're looking for how many duplicates you have. Do you have the appropriate number of duplicates per samples that you have taken and submitted, as well as results? Is there something that maybe looks like it doesn't belong there? We may reach out to you if there's something that looks like it doesn't belong. We also take your comments into consideration. If you think that the QC wasn't what you would like it to be, I have had a few times where I've been processing data and there are notes saying, hey, this doesn't seem right, we're going to downgrade it ourselves. We do take that into consideration as well. And with continuous data, we have the pre and post deployment accuracy checks. Can we really want to make sure that we are posting accurate data. We also look at those field audits, as we mentioned when we were reviewing the templates. And again, any unreasonable results, if something looks like it doesn't belong, we will flag it and potentially reach out to you to see if maybe that's correct, if we need to assign a different DQL based on some extraordinary result. So after the processing, we do import it into our online database, which is Ocwms. This is a database where you can access your data. It's publicly available data. We have the link here. So this data that is imported is mirrored to WQX and STORIT, which are the EPA's, essentially the EPA's databases for water quality monitoring. And if you're curious, if you haven't used Ocwms before and you want to see data for your region, there are tutorials for Ocwms on DEQ's website. You're welcome to search for it, or if you reach out to Nick or I, we can provide you the links to those tutorials. And again, once it's been imported in Ocwms, we do use these data for programs throughout DEQ. So your data is really making a difference in water quality throughout the state.
Hey, Kat.
Yeah.
This is Nick again. Yeah, I just wanted to point out something that I'd forgotten to mention in our prep for this, is that I should emphasize that all of the data that gets submitted to the DEQ through the volunteer monitoring program does make its way into Ocwms as long as it meets the minimum standards for what we were asking for. But
Absolutely.
It doesn't always, but we require consent from each individual organization to actually make that process get mirrored to the water quality exchange and the water quality portal. So for those of you organizations out there that have not provided a written consent and you still want your data, or you do not want your data linked to the water quality portal, please contact me or Kat about that. Again, it's denying consent to get your organization's data to the water quality portal does not mean it's not public. The Ocwms is a public facing database, but it's just some organizations may feel better about not sharing it to the more broad federal database. But again, it's all publicly available through Ocwms either way. So, but we can have a discussion about that. But I just wanted to point that out, is that it's not automatic that all of your data goes to the water quality portal. We do ask consent first.
Thank you. This concludes our training for the Volunteer Monitoring Program's new submission template. Rather than continuing this video with the Q&A, we will be adding a frequently asked questions document to DEQ's Volunteer Monitoring website. If you need further assistance, please contact us at wqvolmon@deq.oregon.gov. Thank you.